My name is Yasser Naeem, and welcome back to my senior project. This is part 2 of my 3-part series on addiction. In the last video, we broke down how addiction physically changes the brain, but addiction isn't just about science. It's about real people, real families, and real struggles. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at what it's like to live with addiction, how it affects daily life, relationships, and people around you. Let's dive in. Addiction is very lucrative in the sense that it doesn't just affect the person using it. Addiction affects everyone around them. For the most part, families are the first to face the consequences of the addiction. Parents, siblings, children, and significant others are always very negatively affected by the consequences of the addiction. A big reason why these addictions are so lethal for families is because of broken trust. A drug or alcohol abuser will likely go to long lengths to keep using while also trying to hide it from their family. The addict may lie, may steal, or even manipulate the family into thinking that what they're doing is okay, when it's really not. Over time, these relationships don't tend to age well. We're going to look at a couple of concepts on this. The first one is separation and divorce. Addiction puts a massive strain on relationships, leading to constant fights, broken trust, and in many cases, separation or divorce. Another one is parental neglect. When addiction takes over, parents can become emotionally or physically absent, leaving kids to fend for themselves and grow up feeling forgotten. The third one we're going to look at is financial struggles. Addiction is expensive, and as it gets worse, bills go unpaid, debts pile up, and families often struggle just to make ends meet. The last one we're going to look at is domestic violence. Substance abuse can make people more aggressive and unpredictable, turning homes into toxic, even dangerous environments. The whole idea of an addict only hurting themselves is false. Families can sometimes get so involved and determined to help those they love, they do it at the cost of their own well-being. They try and try, only to be let down time and time again. A very common example of a drug or alcohol abuser described by families is a grieving person who is still alive. The very person they grew up with is now almost unrecognizable due to how much they've changed from the addiction. A big thing people don't think about before using drugs and alcohol is that some people are more vulnerable to becoming addicted than others. You might be asking, why is that? It is due to a combination of genetics and environment. Elaborating on genetics first, if someone is in your close family and they were a drug or alcohol abuser, you are 4 to 8 times more likely to develop an addiction than maybe your friend who didn't have an abuser in their direct family. Some more studies show that nearly 50% of addiction risk is characterized as inherited. This might sound kind of strange, but this is exactly how genetic works. A couple of concepts to look at are dopamine sensitivity, impulse control, and stress response. Let's start with dopamine sensitivity. Not everyone's brain reacts to drugs and alcohol the same way. Some people have lower levels of dopamine receptors, meaning they don't experience pleasure as intensely as others. When they use substances, their brain floods with dopamine, creating an overwhelming sense of reward that makes them more likely to chase that high again and again. Let's move on to impulse control. Addiction hijacks the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and self-control. This makes it harder for addicts to resist cravings, even when they know the consequences. It's why someone struggling with addiction may promise to quit, but still finds themselves using again and again. Lastly, let's go over stress response. The brain's stress system goes into overdrive in addiction. Substances like drugs and alcohol may provide temporary relief from stress, but over time, they rewire the brain to rely on them for comfort. When an addict tries to quit, their stress levels spike, leading to anxiety, irritability, and intense cravings. As important as genetics are to a person developing an addiction, the environment they are raised in is just as important. A lot of kids that grow up in households where one or more parents are abusers usually cause the kid to become an abuser. Just as the parents may use the drug to feel good and escape from reality, the kid starts to do the exact same thing. Some important factors to look at for kids becoming abusers is growing up with an addicted parent, early exposure to drugs and alcohol, childhood trauma, and peer pressure. Let's start with growing up with addicted parents. Kids who grow up in households with addicted parents often experience neglect, instability, and even abuse, making them more likely to develop an addiction themselves. Genetics also play a role, increasing the risk of substance dependence. The next is early exposure to drugs and alcohol. Using substances at a young age affects brain development, making addiction more likely. What starts as experiment can quickly turn into dependence before the brain fully matures. The human brain doesn't stop developing until the age of 25, so using drugs in your teen years can be very, very dangerous. The next is childhood trauma. Experiencing trauma like abuse, neglect, or loss can lead people to use drugs or alcohol as a way to cope. Substances may numb the pain temporarily, but they often make emotional wounds worse in the long run. Lastly, let's look at peer pressure. The desire to fit in can push people to try substances even when they don't want to. Over time, what started as social use can turn into addiction, making it way harder to stop. As much as genetics are important, they are not always to blame for someone developing an addiction. A lot of the time, the pattern of behaviors from the parents get passed down to the kids without them ever knowing. A big misconception is that most drug addicts are homeless people on the side of the streets asking for spare change, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Addicts can be any demographic and any social status. A lot of the time, it can be even easier for a rich kid to continue because if you might get caught and taken in custody for a few nights, his dad can fight the system and pays bail, while someone of a lower social status will have to face the full consequences and learn from their mistakes. The main idea is that a lot of people with addiction are living normal lives and battling it in silence. A good solution for these types of people is outpatient treatment. A very good example of this is the Phoenix Center. Instead of the addict having to live in a rehab center, they just come for a couple hours every week while also still going to work and being an active parent if they are. They simply continue their everyday lives while getting help for their addiction. Challenges of living with addiction are hiding the habit, managing cravings, fear of being judged, and relapsing. For hiding the habit, addicts often go to great lengths to conceal their substance use, whether it's lying, sneaking around, or making excuses. This constant deception creates stress and guilt, pushing them further into isolation. For managing cravings, cravings can be overwhelmed and unpredictable, making it hard to focus on daily life. The brain constantly seeks the next high, and resisting the urge can feel like an uphill battle, especially in high-stress situations. For fear of being judged, many addicts struggle with shame and worry about how others see them. This fear can prevent them from seeking help, keeping them stuck in the cycle of addiction rather than reaching out for support. And for relapsing, even after periods of sobriety, relapse is a constant risk because addiction rewires the brain. A single moment of weakness or exposure to old triggers can undo months or years of progress, making recovery feel like a never-ending struggle. Many addicts aren't bad people who just want to throw their lives away. They want to stop, but just feel trapped in a cycle of addiction. People just don't understand how hard it is to break through the cycle of addiction. Another big misconception is that addiction is a choice, but it's really not. As we went over in video 1, it literally rewires your brain. This makes it very difficult to quit. A couple of key reasons why quitting is so hard is a damaged prefrontal cortex, withdrawal is really painful, the brain craves balance, and it's difficult to break old habits. Starting with the damaged prefrontal cortex. Addiction weakens the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and self-control. This makes it much harder to resist cravings. For withdrawals being painful, when the body becomes dependent on a substance, stopping can cause intense withdrawal symptoms like nausea, anxiety, shaking, and even severe pain. The discomfort often pushes people to use again just to feel normal. For the brain craving balance, after long-term substance use, the brain adapts to having drugs or alcohol in its system. When those substances are removed, the brain struggles to function properly, creating strong urges to use again just to restore a sense of balance. For old habits being difficult to break, addiction is deeply ingrained in daily routines, making it hard to escape the behaviors linked to substance use. Even smaller triggers, like visiting a familiar place or seeing certain people, can reignite the urge to use. At some point, enough is enough, and families have to make the hard decision. They feel like they've done literally everything, like therapy, rehab, and tough love, but it just never gets the addict to stop. This brings into play the concept of tough love versus enabling. Tough love is a strict approach where you do what you can to try to prevent the addict as much as possible, while enabling is almost like providing them resources to keep doing the addiction. This is one of the hardest decisions a family must make. Do you keep trying to help your loved one, or do you walk away with all hope lost? Some people are able to go their whole lives without quitting the use of drugs or alcohol. This concept is called harm reduction. Harm reduction is when someone doesn't try to become completely sober, just tries to limit the use of substance to a safe amount. Some examples are using methadone or Suboxone for opioid addiction, drinking in moderation instead of binge drinking, and seeking therapy but not entirely quitting. Methadone and Suboxone are great for opioid addictions as they help to reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms. Drinking in moderation is good because some people believe rather than quitting entirely, they can just drink a little bit and still keep control of their lives. And seeking therapy but not entirely quitting is good because people can understand their addiction and develop coping strategies without full commitment to sobriety. Living with addiction is a struggle most people don't see. It affects families, relationships, and entire communities, but understanding it is the first step to change. In the next video, we'll talk about something just as important: recovery. Can addiction be beaten? How does the brain heal? What does it take to truly recover? Stay tuned for part 3.